Alright, should be live in a minute. Okay, we are live. Hello everyone. So, what are we looking at today? I've got some articles ready to read. Some of them are like more news articles, some of them are actual like studies from a bunch of different places. So basically here's what's going on. I'll be honest with you, being straightforward. I am uncertain, like personally, I don't really know much about the relationship between weight and health at the moment because I've gotten a bunch of conflicting information. I think like a lot of people, I was raised with a really straightforward, I'm sure this is wrong, like a lot of people I was raised with a really straightforward, like the fatter you are, the unhealthier you are, and that's just like a simple one-to-one like comparison. I'm quite certain that that is not the case, but the exact relationship is unclear to me, so we're going to be reading through some different sources. We're going to start with the CDC, and we're going to go through there. As always, please, let's we got to get through the sources, so let's not come to any conclusions until we've gotten a variety of sources, until we've looked at a couple different options. Let me make sure OBS is behaving itself. OBS is behaving itself. So let's go ahead and hop right in. Let's start with the CDCs, and then we're just going to move forward from there. I've got a couple different articles, so we'll just go as far as we can. Might skip around a little bit, but let's start with the CDC. So according to the CDC, and do we have an author here? I have some references, page last reviewed in 2020. Don't have an author for this page that I can see, just from the CDC. Okay. People who have obesity compared to those with a normal or healthy weight, so we're talking about obesity specifically here, so a particular BMI, are at increased risk for many serious diseases and health conditions, including the following. So this is specifically referring to obesity then. So all causes of death, mortality. This must be a medical term, because being overweight doesn't increase your likelihood of dying by lightning strike, I assume. High blood pressure, hypertension, high LDL cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, stroke, gallbladder, low quality of life, mental illness such as clinical depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders. For more information, is that it? I genuinely thought this had more to it. Okay, so the CDC seems to be saying, hey, obesity, bad for you. So that's the CDC. I genuinely thought there'd be more information here. Do have a couple of studies, clinical guidelines, managing overweight, systematic review from an obesity expert panel. I might have to look into some of these, pull some of these up. Let's go ahead and just continue. Let's skip around a little bit. So that one was pretty in the, yes, being obese is bad for you in these specific ways category. Let's go ahead and take a look at, this is Very Well Health. This is an article by Richard N. Figueros, who has an MD, and medically reviewed by Yasmin S. Ali, who also has an MD. Okay. Obesity pretty clearly increases one's risk of many medical issues. Okay, so this one, the name of this article, by the way, is Being a Little Overweight Really Okay? Resolving the Controversy Over BMI Measurements. So this Richard N. Figueros seems to be saying obesity specifically pretty clearly increases one's risk of many medical issues. But while society and medical experts have placed great emphasis on maintaining a, quote, normal, unquote, body weight, the excess risk posed by merely being overweight, having a moderately elevated body mass index, BMI, as opposed to being obese, is actually less clear. This news obviously seems to send some mixed messages. Learning more specifics about what the research says can help you better understand your health. Body mass index, BMI. The BMI score is meant to be a quick way of determining whether a person has too much body fat. BMI scores of 20 to 24.9 are considered normal. Scores of 25 to 29.9 are overweight, scores of 30 to 34.9 are obese, and scores above 35 are extremely obese. Scores under 20 are considered underweight. You can easily calculate your score using a calculator. Let's do me. I don't really work out that much anymore. I'm imagining I'm at least overweight. So I am 30. I am 5 foot 10 inches tall, And geez, how much do I weigh? Right? I actually don't know. I think I weigh like 220. I think. I haven't actually weighed myself forever. I'm obese. Okay, so I would be considered obese. Oh no. Virtually all studies using BMI scores agree on a couple of points. People who are obese or extremely obese have an greatly increased risk of all-cause mortality. Virtually all studies using BMI scores agree on a couple of points. People who are underweight also have an increased risk of death. This is thought to be mainly because of underlying disease processes such as heart disease, lung disease, lung disease, cancer infection, which on their own often produce weight loss with disease progression. Okay. If there is a controversy, it centers around individuals who are classed as overweight but not obese, that is, whose BMI scores are a bit over 25. Most studies have shown increased medical risk even for this mild state of overweight, but a few studies show a slightly lower risk for these individuals. Several explanations for this apparent discrepancy have been suggested. The one that has the most traction is the idea that the BMI measure itself, which simply takes into account one's height and weight, often gives a false measurement of, quote, overweight, unquote, if a person is simply in good shape and has good muscle mass. That is, for healthy individuals with BMIs of 25 or 26, the, quote, excess weight, unquote, may not actually be fat. The obesity paradox in heart disease. Since the early 2000s, researchers into mortality for people with heart disease found that several statistics favored those who were in the overweight BMI range. Further large systematic reviews and meta-analyses of studies have supported this finding. So we have some findings that mortality for heart disease, that survival statistics are actually a little bit better, or, well, it doesn't say a little bit better, just says better, for people who are in the overweight BMI range, which is interesting. The idea that people whose BMI measures are above the normal range may have reduced cardiovascular mortality has been called the obesity paradox. A 2015 study published in the journal Heart compiled data from 89 studies, including more than 1.3 million people who had coronary artery disease. Those who were underweight has the highest risk of both short-term and long-term mortality over 3 years. Those who were overweight or obese had a lower risk of short-term and long-term mortality compared with those who had a BMI in the normal weight range. However, those who were in the obese categories had a higher risk of mortality after 5 years of follow-up. A 2018 study analyzed 65 prior studies involving 865,774 people who had coronary artery bypass graft surgery or coronary revascularization with percutaneous coronary intervention. The study confirmed that compared to normal weight individuals, all-cause mortality was increased for underweight people and lower for those who were overweight, obese, or severely obese. Fascinating. Being in the overweight BMI category is associated with the lowest risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. Okay. Why does the obesity paradox exist? Current thinking is that BMI is an insufficient measure of a person's cardiovascular risk since it fails to take into account a person's muscle mass and overall cardiorespiratory fitness. For instance, very fit athletes often have elevated BMIs. On the other hand, people who may formerly have been overweight and then go on to develop heart disease often develop muscle wasting, and their BMIs may drop back into the normal range. So the BMI by itself may give a very misleading picture of a person's cardiovascular health. Many experts now say that instead of relying on the BMI to determine whether weight is contributing to cardiovascular risk, we should think more about abdominal fat. Having too much fat, specifically too much fat in the abdominal area, places significant metabolic stress on the cardiovascular system and increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. The BMI index is very accurate for individuals who are very underweight or very overweight, e.g. it is difficult to put enough muscle mass to get your BMI above 30 without abusing steroids. But BMI is less accurate for detecting individuals who are merely overweight. There are indeed some individuals who have BMI scores in the 25 to 29 range just because they are in great shape, but those individuals probably know who they are. Quote, the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases notes that men should aim for waist circumference under 40 inches and women should aim for waist circumference under 35 inches in order to reduce the risk of diseases associated with obesity. So if you have a BMI score that is in the overweight category, answer this one question. Is your waist size less than your hip size? If so, you are probably one of those people in excellent physical shape, and the excess weight contributed to your BMI is muscle and not fat. But the answer is no, and you have essentially deposited fat. There's reason for concern. While the BMI score is sometimes more easy and useful to measure, the waist to hip ratio is probably the more important index of cardiovascular risk. So this one ended up saying, once again, well, it's a little bit, I don't know that he cited studies for this past this point. It does look like that BMI is not a great indicator of cardiovascular health. This doctor seems to still be coming down on the side of, at the end of the day, having more weight, especially around this, having more fat around the stomach particularly, is bad for you. But it is at least interesting to me that we have a number of people who seem to be healthier or who seem to have better survival rates for heart disease if they're in the obese or overweight category. Whether, I guess the real question we're asking is, this article is suggesting that this is explainable by the fact that BMI is inaccurate, and a lot of those individuals might actually just have a lot of muscle mass. But we would need to see a study to confirm that. We would need to see some kind of confirmation that, okay, so here's what's going on. It's the BMI is messing us up, but I don't know that this article provided that by itself. So let's go ahead and continue. This is from The Atlantic. So why scientists can't agree on whether it's unhealthy to be overweight. Some studies show being overweight leads to a greater risk of death. Others show it doesn't. Here's what's really going on. Oh boy, let's find out. Who wrote this, by the way? This is written by Olga Kazan. Very good. Is being a little overweight bad for you? Could it lead to an untimely death? It's a question with real consequences. Many overweight people feel locked in a fruitless battle with their size. If they do slim down, the process might distort their metabolisms forever. But if they remain overweight, non-thin people may face intense prejudice and stigma, as the writer Taffy Brodesser-Akner poignantly described in the New York Times Magazine recently. I was in Iceland for a story assignment, and the man who owned my hotel took me fishing and said, quote, I'm not going to insist you wear a life jacket since I think you'd float, if you know what I mean, unquote. I ignored him, and then afterwards back on land, after I fished cod like a Viking, he said, quote, I'll call that survival of the fattest, unquote. Jesus. The, quote, health at every size, unquote, movement, though, has its own pitfalls, and not just because it can come off as oddly objectifying. American life expectancy recently dipped slightly, and obesity might be part of the cause. Telling its people it's perfectly fine to be dozens of pounds overweight would be terrible advice, if it's wrong. Most researchers agree that it's unhealthy for the average person to be, say, 300 pounds. They don't really know why being very overweight is bad for you, but the thinking is that all those fat cells disrupt how the body produces and uses insulin, leading to elevated glucose in the blood and eventually diabetes. Extra weight also increases blood pressure, which can ultimately damage the heart. It's fascinating that we don't seem to quite know the exact reason why it's bad for you, although we have theories, clearly. But whether just a few extra pounds raise the risk of death is a surprisingly controversial and polarizing issue. Usually, nutrition scientists tell journalists hedgy things like, quote, this is just what my study shows, unquote, followed by the dreaded disclaimer, quote, further research is needed, unquote. But on this question, the researchers involved are entrenched, having reached opposite conclusions and not budging an inch. Like many internecine wars, the dispute mostly comes down to one small thing: how you define the overweight population in the study. Over the years, myriad sign controversies, personal attacks, money from the Coca-Cola company, and a debate over who was truly, quote, overweight, unquote, have deepened the divide, but they haven't clarified things. It all started in 2004 when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention scientists published a study suggesting that obesity was responsible for 400,000 deaths a year, making it almost as deadly as smoking. It turned out to be a false alarm. The authors made methodological errors that skewed the numbers too high. Excuse me. But a CDC senior scientist named Catherine Flegel was already working with a small group of her colleagues to write a different obesity paper using better data and better methods. In 2005, they published the results, and their estimate was substantially lower. Obesity was only responsible for about 112,000 excess deaths. They also found something peculiar. Being overweight, but not obese, was not associated with an increased risk of death at all. Millions of despairing dieters likely sighed with relief, perhaps celebratorily pouring a Slim Fast down the drain. But while Flegel's study was praised by some researchers, others were skeptical, saying past research had already shown that the heavier you are, the greater your risk of dying. Quote, "We can't afford to be complacent about the epidemic of obesity," unquote, Joanne Manson, the chief of preventative medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, told the New York Times after Flegel's study came out. Flegel pressed on, and in 2013, she and colleagues published a meta-analysis, a study of studies, that replicated her earlier findings. Even when adjusting for smoking, age, and sex, overweight people, those with a body mass index of between 25 and 30, had a 6% lower risk of dying than normal weight individuals. Body mass index, or BMI, is a measure of a person's weight divided by their height. Oh, is that all it is? I actually didn't know it was... Wait, really? Body mass index is just a measure of weight divided by height? I don't think I knew it was that simple. That's stupid. I didn't know BMI was that stupid. That leaves out a lot. Okay, I didn't know that. Her paper found that in terms of mortality, it's better for this number to be slightly elevated than to be normal. A 5 foot 6 inch woman, in other words, would be better off weighing 180 pounds than 120. All right. A, quote, "pile of rubbish," geez, is what Walter Willett, a Harvard University professor of epidemiology and nutrition, deemed that paper. Willett has co-authored studies finding the opposite effect. He and Andrew Stokes, a demographer at Boston University, say Flegel's work suffers from a problem they call reverse causality. They said that because she didn't examine her subject's entire weight history, her study didn't control for people who used to be overweight but became normal weight because they got sick before they died. They argued her study conflates normal weight healthy people with formerly overweight people who lost weight due to liver disease, cancer, or some other illness. Having those individuals in the pool of normal weight people makes the normal weight people seem sicker and the overweight people seem healthier than they actually are. Okay, so he has methodological issues with this study. Quote, "I think Kathy Flegel just doesn't get it that people often lose weight before they die," end quote, Willett told me. In 2016, Willett and dozens of other researchers from around the world published a paper in The Lancet analyzing 239 studies and millions of study subjects. Their takeaway was clear. Above the normal weight range, the fatter you are, the higher your risk of premature death. Quote, "On average, overweight people lose about 1 year of life expectancy, and moderately obese people lose about 3 years of life expectancy," end quote, the paper's lead author, Emmanuel D. Angelantonio told The Guardian. And Flegel takes issue with how Willett and his colleagues selected the studies for their review. Quote, "It seems like they took studies they already knew about and that gave the answers they prefer." Oh, God. All over the place. Said Flegel, who is now a consulting professor at Stanford. Besides, other studies have since implied there's a health benefit to heaviness. Last year, researchers in Copenhagen looked at 3 cohorts of Danes during the 1970s, 90s, and between 2003 and 2013. In the 1970s, the BMI that was associated with the lowest risk of death was 23.7, so-called normal weight. Surprisingly, by the 2000s, the healthiest BMI had shifted up to 27, or technically overweight. Interesting. All right, let's go ahead and take a crack at this. We're going to say, Borg? No, can't be Borg. That's too Star Trek-y. Bourget? I'm going to go with Borg. Borg G. Nordestgaard, there we go, a clinical professor at the University of Copenhagen and an author of that study, speculated that this could be because, over time, doctors have gotten better at treating some of the side effects of excess weight, like high blood pressure and high triglycerides. Interesting. Or, quote, "It could just be that as the population has become more overweight and obese, the people who are in the middle of the BMI distribution, though these are the most normal people, they're the ones who do all the most normal things," Nordestgaard said. "They're the ones who survive the best." Interesting. I'm not quite sure I understand what's being said there. What's more, in 2014, New Orleans cardiologist Carl Levy published the book The Obesity Paradox, When Thinner Means Sicker and Healthier and Heavier Means Healthier, based in part on his research showing that overweight and mildly obese patients with cardiovascular disease have a better prognosis than their leaner counterparts. But when reporters found that Levy had received money from Coca-Cola Company for speaking and consulting on obesity, it fueled speculation that junk food companies are prompting the supposed benefits of obesity in order to avoid blame for causing it. In an email, Levy said Coca-Cola only funded a few of his lectures, of which he gives more than 100 a year. Interesting. Andrew Stokes, the demographer at Boston University, says some of the most vocal supporters of the obesity paradox are activists and people with vested interests. Well, that's always and forever the case about everything all the time, isn't it? He found that the paradox disappears when normal weight is defined as only those people who have remained thin over time, as opposed to who have entered the normal weight category after losing weight due to illness. In a paper published this April, Stokes, Willett, and others found being overweight was associated with mortality, but only if you looked at a person's maximum weight over the past 16 years. According to their findings, it's having ever been overweight that's risky. Well, that seems like garbo. That's not the end of the methodological gripes, though. Flegel and the others say the self-report data that Willett and Stokes use in some of their studies is not reliable. Quote, "It is well known that underreporting of body weight along with underreporting for females and overreporting for males of height can result in biased BMIs," said Barry Graubard, a senior investigator at the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. Stokes counters that not only has self-report data been found to correspond closely with measured weight, not all of the data refuting the obesity paradox is self-reported. Flegel, meanwhile, thinks Stokes and others haven't demonstrated that the weight loss was the result of a sickness, or that the sickness-induced weight loss is a big enough problem to taint an entire study. She also thinks his results are consistent with her 2013 meta-analysis, falling, quote, "pretty much in the middle of the other studies that we found," end quote. Stokes disputes this. He also began one of our phone calls by asking me if I was regretting doing the story yet. If a little extra pudge is somehow good for you, it's not clear why. Some researchers suggest overweight people might be better equipped to fight off certain diseases, with fat serving as the last-ditch fuel for the ailing body. And they point to studies that failed to show that losing weight led to less heart disease in overweight people. Interesting. Stokes, meanwhile, thinks that the explanation is speculative, and it pales compared to the many ways obesity harms health. Even a BMI of 25, for example, just barely overweight, has been associated with an increased risk of diabetes. I'm curious what percentage. See, that's increased risk of diabetes. Are we talking like a 0.2% increase to 0.3% increase? Like, I always want to know what the increase is here and how much it matters. There's also the idea that some people we now consider overweight, say a 6 foot 1 inch man who weighs 200 pounds, don't actually have too much fat. For one thing, athletes and other very muscular people might be wrongly categorized as overweight. We've talked about this before. Changing that, better the world. The French always push. General, it's better to weigh less. When America's Europe, we weigh more. We're not as beautiful. Okay, the new standard means that if you showed someone with a 26 BMI had no excess mortality in 1996, there would be no question, Flegel said. She speculates the change was made to emphasize the seriousness of the obesity epidemic, and she notes that her critics have expressed fears her results might lull the public into complacency about obesity. Quote, "The problem with my research is apparently just that I did it," unquote, she said. Quote, "That's not science," unquote. All right. But there's a big caveat to this theory. Medical advice urging heavy people to lose weight is based on the premise that being overweight is unhealthy. If Flegel and Nordestgaard are right and being overweight is linked with less mortality, then should people whose BMIs fall in the normal range gain weight? Should they be guzzling milkshakes in hopes of staving off death? Both Flegel and Nordestgaard said, quote, "No," unquote. Quote, "Weight is just one risk factor for both of these conditions. It's not the risk factor," Flegel said. She points out that some studies show people with doctorate degrees live longer than those with bachelor's degrees. If someone tells me I have a bachelor's degree, but I know the risk is lower if I have a doctoral degree, should I tell them to go get a PhD? She reiterated something, perhaps the only thing that epidemiologists who work on this issue can still agree on. It's associated, the causality is unclear. Thank you, Olga Kazan. That was a very interesting article. In fact, I'm really glad I read this because that broke down a lot of the stuff that I was wondering about. I think that's enough for right now. I've got more articles to read later. Thank you for listening along with me. Be good to one another. Have a good day.